Okay, so I thought that might be enough to just kick off the discussion, and I'd love to see where you'd like to take the discussion, what comments or questions you have.
Thank you, sir. You've spoken a little bit about the use of making sure that we have clear political objectives in achieving strategic competence. And looking at the 2017 NSS and the unclassified NDS summary, it appears that we refer to, in the course of great power competition, Russia and China as revisionist actors with whom we will compete. Mm-hmm. But is competition in and of itself an adequate grand strategy? And what are the specific political objectives that competition vis-a-vis Russia and China is meant to achieve?
Okay, great. All right, so of course, in an unclassified document, you're not going to have all of the details. What we put in place is a process that would deliver what we called integrated strategies around 16. We identified 16 first-order national security challenges, and those challenges were posed in the form of a question. Then the framing session would determine what the overarching goal, more specific objectives were. And then after the president approved that framing, I would send a cabinet memo out to the departments and agencies to implement a new policy, because we had enough there, right? The goals, the objectives, our assumptions, our description of the challenge. But then that session, that framing session, had the purpose of approving the framing, but then allowing the principals, the members of the cabinet, to give their guidance to the Policy Coordinating Committee, which is the interagency group that convenes around a particular issue to develop the integrated strategy. They would work together on drafting an integrated strategy, and I insisted that those strategies go forward to the president with multiple options for implementation, right? So we had the framing approved, but and those options were differentiated by risk, level of resources, amount of time estimated, to implement that strategy, the degree to which we felt they were adequate to accomplish the objectives. And then once the president made the decision on those integrated strategies, those went out for implementation, and that PCC, that Policy Coordinating Committee, would then work on an implementation plan, right? And all of them went through that cycle. And I think what you're seeing, maybe imperfectly executed at times, are the implementation of those strategies. So on Russia, to answer your question on Russia, really, I think our strategy, without going into any details, is oriented on three fundamental things. Will be no surprise to you. Three fundamental objectives. The first is to confront Russia's destabilizing behavior, right, and to ensure that Russia does not continue to extend its destabilizing behavior in Europe or in the greater Middle East or elsewhere. That involves, in large measure, imposing costs on Russia beyond the costs that Putin may have factored in at the beginning of his decision process. And that relates to the second category or area of focus, which is to deter conflict with Russia. So as we're confronting destabilizing behavior, we want to deter other forms of conflict with a nuclear power, right? And that in particular involves efforts in two areas: the ability to deter conflict, maybe under this framework of Russian new generation warfare, where Russia tries to accomplish its objectives below the threshold of what might elicit a concerted response, but also deterring war through deterrence by denial, right? What Thomas Schelling wrote about in the 1960s, which is convincing your adversary, your enemy, that he cannot accomplish his objectives through the use of force. That involves also now different types of use of force, involving conventional and unconventional forces, but nuclear forces as well. This is why the pullout of the INF Treaty was part of the strategy, because if only one party is adhering to a treaty, it's not a treaty. It's kind of just a fantasy, right? I mean, it's not really happening. And it was important to restore the deterrent capability for intermediate range missiles, and maybe as a first step in getting another INF treaty as an example. But then also deterrence in space and deterrence in cyberspace, what that really means. And so a lot of work went into that. And then finally, we want to look for areas of cooperation with Russia, but it's very difficult while Putin is in power. And the reason, again, is what I mentioned at the outset, are the emotions, aspirations, cultural biases that drive the other. And I think Vladimir Putin is driven mainly by fear, fear of a collapse of this kleptocratic order that he is on top of. It's essentially a protection racket where he has dirt on everybody and prevents them from killing each other, in a figurative sense. And also this sense of honor lost, right? Thucydides said 2,500 years ago, that nations go to war for three fundamental reasons: fear, honor, and interest. And I think that's still a useful framework for assessing the emotions that drive our adversaries. Thanks. Yes.
Hi, thank you for speaking to us. So my question is about the idea of the need for forward deployment of troops. You've spoken about the importance, and certainly there is a need for it in terms of military readiness in some areas of the world. But my question is what you see as the role of DoD in countering these new forms of violent extremism, especially when, in light of NSC documents, OIG reports, even DoD reports, point to the fact that deployment of troops and a really forward-facing military presence has been failing in attempting to kind of reach the hearts and minds of people in a lot of these countries where there is radicalism and support for a lot of these hostile groups. And so using that kind of integrated approach that you talked about, what do you see, or what type of policy steps do you think are important for DOS, DOD to coordinate on?
Okay. All right, so I think that wherever we're going to put troops, we have to assess all the factors that you're raising. This is what some people have called the antibody thesis, right? That by U.S. forces being overseas and interacting with populations, that those populations will see those forces in an oppressive way. A lot of that has to do with the degree to which we're able to clarify our intentions with our words as well as our deeds while we're there operating in and among populations and with indigenous security forces. And it also has to do with the nature of the conflict and how the population views our force, especially in relation to our enemies. And I would say that in Afghanistan, that there's been a misconception there as an example, right? I mean, 90%, easily 90% of the Afghan population do not want to live under Taliban rule. But still, because Americans in large measure don't understand the nature of the conflict, they see our presence and our efforts and our operations in Afghanistan as similar to the to the Soviet-Afghan War or the Anglo-Afghan wars, when in fact those were wars to subjugate Afghanistan to the will of those particular countries. And what you have in Afghanistan now is an elected government that is besieged by terrorists whose base is across the border in Pakistan. And I think that these terrorists happen to also be the enemies of all civilized people. And in fact, it's not theoretical, right? I mean, it actually happened that territory was used as the base for planning and organizing mass murder attacks against the United States, but also in other countries as well. And so I think that what we have to do is we have to evaluate the degree to which having our forces forward are contributing to our national security and how important it is. I think that in Afghanistan, really what is at stake is the potential for the Taliban to accomplish what it said it wants to accomplish, right? Which is to establish an Afghan emirate that will be part of the larger caliphate that is connected to this jihadist terrorist movement. And what you have in Afghanistan is the opportunity to use the drug trade to make enormous amounts of money that can be used to then finance, organize, prepare, plan, execute attacks against the civilized world. So I think that the stakes are high, and I think 14,000 troops in Afghanistan is not overly burdensome, right? It's something we ought to be able to sustain. From a historical perspective, we had hundreds of thousands of troops 300,000 troops in Europe until the 90s. We had a couple 100,000 troops on the Korean Peninsula until the 1960s, and then a significant amount all the way till today. It was still 30,000. So I think that we have to recognize that we need We need sustainable strategies against these enemies in particular, because they're not going away. I think we have to just pay attention to, to the nature of our enemy. I think on Afghanistan, as an example, we have created these myths about the war, right? And those myths are that that there's a bold line, for example, between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. It doesn't exist, right? They are overlapping and interconnected. They share the same ecosystem as well with other groups like Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, which has been the backbone organization for ISIS Khorasan, which just committed the mass murder in the wedding hall in Kabul yesterday. So we have to recognize really the nature of the problem, view that problem through the lens of our vital interests, and take into consideration the factors you brought up. What is the degree to which our presence is important to our national security, and what are the second and third order effects of the presence in those operations? Yes.
Thanks very much, sir.
Yeah.
I want to ask about the limits that the U.S. military sets on itself, the military being an extension and ultimately accountable to political forces. World War II being an easy example where civilian population bombings were off limits until they weren't. Today, the peaceful uses of outer space have been reconsidered, potentially lethal but autonomous AI. I wonder at what point in the pipeline the military starts planning to use things previously unacceptable or inaccessible to it, and sort of what role that plays in strategic thinking.
Well, I think that you can't go wrong with going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, right? I mean, it's really everything that we do from a legal perspective in war, jus in bello, is tied to just war theory, right? And in particular, anything that you do ought to meet the various tests that Thomas Aquinas put out there, right? That it has to be for a just end, right? That's why I think the war in Afghanistan for many years was not only waged incompetently but also unethically, because I think the one administration in particular wasn't trying to achieve a just end. It was actually just trying to leave, but soldiers were still in combat, taking risks and making sacrifices without a clearly defined just end. But the two main criteria for just war, jus in bello, are proportionality and discrimination. And so the application of force has to be proportional to the risk that you're facing and the ends that you want to achieve, and you have to be able to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. And I think that our military, more than any other, has that at the center of what we do every day. There are all sorts of rules of engagement that are created and so forth to give you more specific guidance, but it really all is based on just war theory. In terms of new domains of competition, it's Department of Defense policy not to develop and implement completely autonomous weapon systems. There has to be a human being, in the loop or on the loop, in connection with every decision associated with the application of lethal force, right? And I think what you don't see in media accounts is that our soldiers, every day take additional risk onto themselves to ensure that they can protect civilians. And of course, there are breakdowns in discipline, and you hear quite a bit about those, or the use of force that's disproportionate. And of course, I mean, war is confusing, and the application of force against the enemy, an enemy that's intermingling with civilian populations, can cause unintended harm. But I think our military, from my personal experience, is imbued with this idea of proportion, these ideas associated with proportionality and discrimination, and take additional risks on themselves to protect civilians. I think they do that from a Kantian perspective of treating man and women as an end rather than a means, but also from a utilitarian perspective of if you're harming civilians, right, you're undercutting your mission, and you're creating opportunities for your enemy. Yes. And I'll go over there next. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. I'd love to hear you talk more about strategy with hostile states, and specifically how you see our actions with Iran affecting our actions and maybe credibility with North Korea.
Okay. Well, on Iran, you're probably talking about the Iran nuclear deal and so forth. I think the problem with the Iran nuclear deal was that it was based, again, on some of these flawed assumptions that were implicit and therefore went unchallenged. The main assumption was that Iran, having been welcomed back in the international community with this deal as the first step, would begin to moderate its behavior in terms of its support for terrorist organizations, from Hezbollah to the militias in Syria and its proxy army in Syria, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and so forth. And what the Obama administration did is they said, okay, we're not going to worry about all these other issues. We're just going to focus on the nuclear issue in itself. But that too was a flawed assumption because it's not disconnected, right? The nuclear deal, and especially the alleviation of sanctions associated with nuclear deal, is not disconnected from Iran's broad range of destructive activities in the region. And what happened is the lifting of sanctions was a huge economic boon to the regime. That was actually, that economic boom, another assumption, was supposed to empower alternative sources of power within Iran, commercial sources of power that could then, mitigate, right, the extremists or the revolutionaries wing within the Iranian government. Well, hey, but guess what? All it did was it just strengthened the revolutionary wing because they control the businesses through the bunyads and then also through the IRGC owned and controlled and operated businesses. So what did Iran do? It did the opposite of what the assumption was. It just poured that money into the IRGC, and they ramped up. There were some increasing oil prices as well, which benefited them economically, and they actually accelerated this sectarian civil war across the region that is creating a humanitarian and political catastrophe, right? And that affected countries in the region, but also has affected Europe, as you've seen with the refugee crisis, and then the growth of nativist and right-wing nationalist parties in Europe. So, I mean, the consequences were devastating of the JCPOA. So when I came into this job, the observation that we made was that the problem under the Obama administration was they treated the JCPOA as if it was an Iran strategy. It wasn't. It was just a piece of a strategy, and decisions should have been placed in a broader perspective. So what we did is we framed, an Iran strategy, and then put decisions, and then considered decisions on JCPOA within that. Now, you may have heard, I advocated for staying in because we're already in. It had changed the dynamic. And I thought what we could do is achieve objectives associated with Iran's destructive behavior really outside of the deal, right? By imposing sanctions on Iran for its missile program in violation of UN Security Council resolutions associated with the missile program, but then also its support for terrorists and proxy forces across the region, thereby placing the economic constraints back on Iran, and then at the same time working to address the technical deficiencies in that deal, right? Which have to do with, insufficient verification and inspection capabilities, as well as not addressing the missile program and the sunset clause. Now, every time this was one of my least favorite things to do. It was like to bring this decision to the president, because it was like every 3 months, he hated the deal. And so, I just resolved, hey, whatever he decides, we're going to have a plan to put in either way. So the decision was taken after I left the White House to pull out. By that time, I just figured, okay, there are advantages to pulling out too, right? Because what that does is that immediately constrains the regime, puts them under a lot more economic pressure. But to answer your question, okay, well, so what? What are these decisions supposed to accomplish? I think a useful way of thinking about what we would like to see in Iran is not regime change like Iraq 2003, but a shift, maybe a slow shift in the nature of the regime, such that it ceases its permanent hostility to the United States, Israel, and the West, right? I think that ought to be something to shoot for, and then you can evaluate the decisions you take, right, based on do they contribute to that goal or not, right? And so I believe I know there is an Iran strategy in place. I think that in the execution of that strategy, what I would endeavor to do better is to highlight the behavior of that regime from a historical perspective. Part of the problem, again, with the JCPOA, it didn't really consider the pattern of Iranian behavior since 1979. Iran has been demonstrably, fighting a proxy war against us, right, for 40 years. And so it's really illogical for us to think that behavior is just going to suddenly change. The other aspect is to really understand better the internal dynamics within the regime. It's hard to do at times, but I think you can say with a degree of confidence now, hey, if there was a competition between the Republicans in the government, those are those who would want more of a constitutional form of government, at least a better veneer of democracy and so forth, and the revolutionaries have won. Okay, the so-called moderates in Iran, I think, are in jail or like in Houston. They're not in the government. They're not in power for sure. Now, does that mean this regime is going to be stable forever? No. Instability in Iran is kind of a myth, right? But that doesn't mean we have to be active participants in the Iranian people determining their future. But we ought not to take actions that bolster that regime. In particular, I think we shouldn't take any credit, for what's happening with the Iranian economy today. We should give full credit to the criminals that are in charge of that government. There are about $800 billion of oil revenue that are unaccounted for under Ahmadinejad's presidency. Where did that go? These are the questions the Iranian people ought to be asking. And hey, as our economy is tubing, why are we spending billions of dollars to perpetuate a sectarian civil war across the greater Middle East? So I think there is an Iran strategy in place. I think that as we implement it, we ought to get more multinational support behind it, and we ought to put the responsibility for the failing of that state on those that are actually making it fail.